July 29th, 1944. Centralnaya Uglovaya Naval Air Base near Vladivostok. Lieutenant Colonel Semyon Raydel stood on the tarmac watching something that should not have existed. Through the summer heat, shimmer rising from concrete laid down by Soviet laborers just months earlier, a massive four-engine bomber descended toward the runway, its aluminum skin catching the afternoon sun like polished silver. The aircraft was enormous, dwarfing every Soviet bomber Raydel had ever seen. Its sleek lines spoke of design philosophy decades ahead of anything in the Soviet inventory. This was Ramp Tramp, serial number 426256, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress that had just completed an emergency landing after suffering engine failure during a bombing raid on Japanese steel mills in Manchuria. Captain Howard Jarrell and his crew, exhausted from their harrowing flight across hostile territory, taxied to a stop and shut down the remaining three Wright R-3350 engines. They had no idea they had just delivered to Joseph Stalin the technological blueprint that would transform Soviet aviation and terrify the Western world. Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov received Rydell's initial report with barely concealed excitement. The technical specifications read like science fiction compared to Soviet capabilities. Pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets coordinated by analog computers, four engines producing 2,200 horsepower each, supercharged to maintain full power at altitudes where Soviet fighters struggled to climb. A bomb load of 20,000 pounds delivered to targets 3,000 miles away. Combat ceiling above 31,000 feet, higher than most Soviet interceptors could reach. Kuznetsov's response to Moscow captured what every Soviet aviation expert would soon discover: the lavish use of lightweight aluminum alloys, pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled guns, powerful supercharged engines, Norden bomb sight, radar, electronics, and instrumentation, all represented an advanced level of technology beyond Soviet industry's reach. This was not an incremental improvement over existing designs. This was a generational leap that Soviet engineers had not imagined possible. Within weeks, two more B-29s landed at the same base. On August 20th, 1944, Kate Paumat II, serial 42-93829, diverted to Soviet territory after sustaining damage from anti-aircraft fire over the Yawata Iron Works. On November 11th, the General H. Arnold Special 42-6365 arrived after flying through a typhoon that destroyed its central fire control system and left the crew hopelessly lost. A fourth B-29 crashed east of Khabarovsk after the crew bailed out, providing the wreckage of yet another example. American demands for the return of aircraft and crews met with Soviet silence. The crews would eventually be released through elaborate escapes into Iran, smuggled across borders with Soviet cooperation that maintained plausible deniability. But the aircraft would never return. Stalin had recognized what these machines represented: a technology gap so vast that closing it through conventional development would take a decade. The alternative was audacious theft on an unprecedented scale. June 22, 1945. Stalin issued orders that would mobilize the entire Soviet aviation industry. 3 B-29s were transferred to the Tupolev Design Bureau in Moscow. Andrei Tupolev, recently released from imprisonment in Stalin's gulags on fabricated charges of aiding Nazi Germany, found himself commanding the most important aviation project in Soviet history. The mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution. Copy the B-29 exactly, every component, every system, every specification. Complete production-ready aircraft within 2 years. Tupolev understood immediately what Stalin could not. The B-29 was not simply an aircraft. It was an entire industrial ecosystem that the Soviet Union did not possess. The aluminum skin measured 1/16-inch thick, a dimension that required 1.5875 millimeters in metric measurement. Soviet mills could not produce aluminum sheets to that specification. The alloys themselves were unfamiliar, requiring metallurgists to reverse engineer compositions from samples taken from the airframe. The Wright R-3350 engine represented power plant technology 5 years ahead of Soviet capabilities. Most daunting of all was the central fire control system. 5 General Electric analog computers coordinated the defensive armament, calculating lead angles based on aircraft speed, altitude, temperature, humidity, and target movement. Gunners aimed optically through remote sights while the computers moved the turrets and adjusted for ballistics. The system allowed a single gunner to control multiple turret positions simultaneously, multiplying defensive firepower while reducing crew requirements. Soviet engineers studying the system could barely comprehend how it functioned, much less how to replicate it. The reverse engineering effort involved 900 factories and research institutes across the Soviet Union. Every component had to be measured, photographed, analyzed, and assigned to appropriate manufacturing facilities. The team generated 105,000 detailed engineering drawings in the first year. Every dimension had to be verified, every material composition analyzed, every electrical circuit traced and documented. Tupolev divided the three aircraft by function. Ramp-Tramp, the most intact specimen, became the reference standard, maintained in flying condition for comparison testing. General H.H. Arnold Special was completely disassembled, every component cataloged and measured. Ding Hao provided backup reference when questions arose about assembly sequences or component interactions. Soviet test pilots who flew the captured B-29s discovered capabilities that seemed impossible. Major Mark Galai, one of the Soviet Union's most experienced test pilots, recorded his impressions after his first flight in Ramp-Tramp. The American aircraft flies like nothing in our inventory. The pressurized cabin allows operations at altitudes where our crews would require bulky oxygen equipment and heated suits. The pilot simply breathes normally while flying at 30,000 feet. The visibility from the greenhouse canopy provides panoramic awareness impossible in Soviet designs. The flight controls, though heavy without boost, respond predictably at all speeds and altitudes. Most impressive is the sheer power available. The engines maintain full output at altitudes where Soviet power plants gasp for oxygen. But flying the B-29 revealed challenges that would plague Soviet attempts to duplicate it. The pressurization system developed by Garrett I Research represented technology Soviet industry had never attempted in production aircraft. The system maintained cabin pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet altitude even when flying at 30,000 feet, dramatically reducing crew fatigue and improving combat effectiveness. 3 separate pressurized compartments, forward crew area, rear gunner station, and tail gunner position, connected by a pressurized tunnel that passed over 2 unpressurized bomb bays. Soviet engineers examining the pressurization system discovered precision engineering that Soviet manufacturing standards could not match. Airtight seals required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Pressure regulators automatically maintained cabin environment through altitude changes from sea level to maximum operating ceiling. Gasoline-powered heaters provided warmth automatically controlled by thermostats. The entire system operated seamlessly, requiring minimal crew intervention. Leonid Kerber, an engineer working alongside Tupolev, described the atmosphere of fear that pervaded the project. Tupolev was so terrified of Stalin and Lavrenti Beria, chief of Stalin's secret police, that he insisted on copying every detail exactly, no matter how insignificant. When engineers suggested improvements or Soviet substitutions that might simplify production, Tupolev refused. Stalin's orders specified an exact copy. Any deviation risked accusations of sabotage or incompetence, charges that could result in execution or return to the gulag. The obsessive attention to detail produced legendary stories, some exaggerated but rooted in truth. Soviet copies allegedly included a repair patch found on one of the captured aircraft. A typewriter left aboard by an American crewman supposedly became standard equipment on early Tu-4 production models because engineers feared excluding it might violate Stalin's orders. While some details were embellished in retelling, the fundamental truth remained. Soviet engineers lived in such fear of Stalin that they copied components whose function they did not understand rather than risk elimination for independent decision-making. The magnitude of the reverse engineering challenge exceeded anything attempted in aviation history. The B-29 contained over 55,000 individual parts, each requiring in-measurement, analysis, and reproduction. 8 miles of electrical wiring threaded through the airframe, connecting systems whose complexity dwarfed anything Soviet designers had encountered. The analog fire control computers alone represented technology that Soviet engineers initially doubted they could replicate. Material science posed immediate obstacles. American aluminum alloys combined strength with lightweight through compositions Soviet metallurgists had never produced. The 1/16-inch skin thickness fell between metric standards, forcing compromise. Soviet engineers ultimately varied skin thickness between 0.8 and 1.8 millimeters, strengthening some areas while accepting weight penalties. Despite these modifications, the prototype Tu-4 weighed only 340 kilograms more than the B-29, less than 1% heavier. The Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone engine presented challenges that threatened the entire project. Soviet engine designers had licensed Wright radial engines in the past, building copies and modifications for domestic use. But the R-3350 represented the pinnacle of piston engine development, producing 2,200 horsepower through advanced supercharging and turbocharging that maintained sea-level performance at stratospheric altitudes. Arkady Shvetsov, Soviet engine designer, developed the AH-73TK as a substitute power plant. Based on earlier Soviet copies of Wright designs, the AH-73TK produced 2,300 horsepower, theoretically exceeding American specifications. But initial production engines suffered from the same problems that had plagued early B-29 operations. Induction system fires erupted during takeoff when engines operated at maximum power. Cooling proved inadequate, causing overheating that led to catastrophic failures. Propellers failed at alarming rates. Soviet metallurgy could not match American standards, resulting in components that failed under stresses the Wright engines routinely handled. The defensive armament system represented technology so advanced that even Tupolev expressed surprise when his engineers successfully duplicated it. The B-29's 5 remote-controlled turrets were coordinated by General Electric computers that calculated firing solutions in real time. Gunners tracked targets through optical sights while the computers adjusted turret positions based on dozens of variables: temperature, humidity, altitude, airspeed, target range, target movement, projectile ballistics, all factors the computers incorporated instantaneously. Soviet engineers dissecting the fire control system discovered miniaturized components whose manufacture required precision, tooling Soviet factories did not possess. Intricate switches, specialized vacuum tubes, precision resistors, and capacitors. Thousands of parts whose specifications had to be reverse engineered and assigned to manufacturers who had never attempted such work. The learning curve was vertical. Factories accustomed to producing robust, simple military equipment now faced requirements for components whose tolerances left no margin for error. The deadline pressure was relentless. Stalin demanded 20 production-ready Tu-4s within 2 years. Tupolev marshaled resources across the Soviet industrial complex. Design bureaus worked around the clock, generating technical drawings. Research institutes analyzed materials and developed substitutes when direct replication proved impossible. Factories retooled production lines, often multiple times as specifications were refined. Workers were sometimes permitted only 1 day off per month during critical phases. The psychological pressure proved as challenging as the technical obstacles. Any deviation from specifications risked accusations of sabotage. Engineers who suggested improvements faced interrogation about their motives. Workers who made mistakes could be denounced to the secret police, charged with deliberately undermining the project. Fear became a management tool, driving performance through terror rather than incentive. May 19, 1947. Test pilot Nikolai Rybko advanced the throttles on the prototype Tu-4 and began the takeoff roll from the factory airfield near Moscow. The 4 AH-73TK engines roared to full power, their combined 9,200 horsepower pulling the massive bomber into the air. Rybko carefully managed the climb, monitoring temperatures that edged toward redline as the engine strained against the aircraft's 7-ton weight. The flight test program would reveal problems that months of additional work would be required to resolve, but the aircraft flew. Less than 2 years after Stalin issued his orders, Soviet industry had accomplished what American experts believed impossible. The prototype demonstrated capabilities that shocked Soviet observers accustomed to their own bomber designs. The Tu-4 climbed to altitudes Soviet fighters struggled to reach. The pressurized cabin provided comfort unimaginable in unpressurized Soviet aircraft. The remote-controlled defensive armament functioned as designed, though Soviet engineers had substituted 23mm Nudelman NS-23 cannons for the original .50 caliber machine guns, providing heavier firepower at longer range. But the prototype also revealed the compromises inherent in rushed development. During one test flight, engineer Leonid Kerber accompanied test pilot Mark Galli on a delivery flight from Kazan to Moscow. Hot air filled the pressurized compartments when the air conditioning system failed. Despite frantic efforts, no one could restore cooling. The crew arrived in Moscow drenched in sweat, having endured temperatures that made the pressurized compartment feel like a sauna. The welcoming reception was canceled because the passengers looked as if they had just walked in from the beach. Production began immediately despite ongoing problems. The Soviet leadership could not wait for refinements. The geopolitical situation demanded a strategic bomber capable of threatening Western cities. American B-29s had devastated Japan, culminating in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those attacks demonstrated that strategic air power could end wars without requiring ground invasions. Stalin needed equivalent capability to deter American aggression and project Soviet power. August 3, 1947. Tushino Airfield, northwest of Moscow. Foreign military attachés and Western diplomats gathered for the annual Soviet Aviation Day parade, a showcase of Soviet air power designed to intimidate potential adversaries while demonstrating technological prowess. The observers, including American, British, and other Allied representatives, expected to see updated versions of familiar Soviet designs, incremental improvements on existing aircraft. At 600 feet altitude, 3 large bombers appeared, flying in tight formation toward the reviewing stands. American observers immediately recognized the silhouette, B-29 Superfortresses. The Americans assumed these were the 3 aircraft that had made emergency landings in Soviet territory 3 years earlier, repainted with Soviet markings for propaganda purposes. Anger mixed with resignation. The Soviets were flaunting their theft of American property, rubbing Western noses in their refusal to return the aircraft. Then a 4th bomber appeared. The realization hit Western observers like a physical blow. The Soviets had not simply kept 3 stolen aircraft. They had reverse-engineered the B-29 and put it into production. 4 aircraft meant at least 4, probably more, already built or in production. The implications were staggering. The Soviet Union now possessed strategic bombing capability that could threaten European cities and potentially reach the American mainland on one-way missions. Air Marshal Alexander Golovanov piloted one of the Tu-4s in the flyby, personally demonstrating Soviet mastery of American technology. The formation was followed by a Tu-70, a passenger transport variant based on the B-29 design, making Western denials impossible. The Soviets had not stumbled onto 3 aircraft and barely kept them flying. They had systematically analyzed, reverse-engineered, and improved upon American technology, creating an industrial capability that could mass-produce the most advanced bomber in existence. American military attachés watching the flyby understood immediately what Pentagon planners would soon confirm. The Tu-4 had sufficient range to attack Chicago or Los Angeles on one-way suicide missions. European cities were well within range for round-trip strikes. Combined with Soviet atomic weapon development, which Western intelligence knew was progressing rapidly, the Tu-4 transformed the strategic balance. The Soviet Union had acquired the capacity to deliver nuclear weapons to targets anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. The American faces at Tushino that August day reportedly showed shock that bordered on panic. Years of effort and billions of dollars had produced the B-29, America's most advanced weapon system. The United States had carefully guarded access to the technology, refusing even to provide examples to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, despite repeated requests. 3 accidental landings had handed Stalin exactly what American policy had denied him, and Soviet industry had accomplished in 2 years what American planners believed would require a decade. Stalin's satisfaction with the Tu-4 reveal at Tushino was short-lived, as he died in March 1953. But his legacy transformed Soviet aviation. Production of the Tu-4 continued through 1952, with 847 aircraft manufactured before newer designs superseded it. The manufacturing knowledge and industrial capabilities developed during the Tu-4 program enabled the rapid development of follow-on bombers like the Tu-16 jet bomber and the turboprop-powered Tu-95 Bear, which remains in service today. The Tu-4 proved its capabilities in ways that justified Stalin's gamble. On October 18, 1951, a modified Tu-4 dropped the Soviet Union's first air-delivered atomic bomb, the RDS-1 device. Soviet nuclear deterrence now had a credible delivery system. Western planners faced the reality that Soviet bombers could reach any target in Europe and many in North America, carrying weapons whose destructive power matched America's atomic arsenal. For Soviet pilots who transitioned to the Tu-4 from earlier bombers, the experience revealed how far behind Soviet aviation had fallen. Colonel Vladimir Reshetnikov, who flew both Soviet-designed bombers and the Tu-4, described the difference in stark terms. Flying the Tu-4 was like entering a different era of aviation. The pressurized cabin meant we could operate at altitudes where earlier bombers required crews to wear bulky oxygen equipment and electrically heated suits. The visibility from the greenhouse canopy provided situational awareness impossible in Soviet designs, with limited windows and thick armor plate blocking the view. The remote-controlled defensive armament responded instantly, requiring only that gunners track targets while computers handled ballistic calculations. Most impressive was the navigation and bombing equipment, systems so sophisticated that we could locate and strike targets with accuracy we had never achieved in Soviet aircraft. The transformation extended beyond individual aircraft capabilities to operational concepts. Soviet bomber doctrine before the Tu-4 emphasized low-altitude attacks using terrain masking and darkness to penetrate defenses. The Tu-4's high-altitude performance enabled different tactics. Formations could cruise above 30,000 feet, beyond the effective ceiling of most interceptors and anti-aircraft guns. The aircraft could penetrate deep into enemy airspace, deliver their weapons, and return home before defenses could respond effectively. This capability fundamentally changed Soviet strategic thinking about air power. Western air forces responded to the Tu-4 threat with urgent programs to develop effective countermeasures. The Royal Air Force Central Fighter Establishment conducted extensive tests using RAF Gloucester Meteor and de Havilland Vampire jet fighters against borrowed B-29s to determine optimal attack tactics against Tu-4 type bombers. The tests revealed that even early jets could intercept the propeller-driven Tu-4 at altitude, but the defensive firepower posed significant risks. The 23mm cannons mounted in Tu-4 turrets outranged typical fighter armament, allowing Soviet bombers to engage interceptors before fighters closed within their own weapons range. American defensive planning assumed that Soviet Tu-4s would be deployed in the same mass formations that had characterized American B-29 operations over Japan. Dozens or hundreds of bombers flying mutual support, their combined defensive firepower creating zones that interceptors penetrated at their peril. American air defense systems, radar networks, fighter interceptor squadrons, and surface-to-air missiles developed during the late 1940s and early 1950s were designed primarily to counter the Tu-4 threat. The intelligence community worked frantically to determine Tu-4 production rates and deployment locations. Satellite reconnaissance did not yet exist. Western knowledge of Soviet capabilities derived from aerial reconnaissance flights along Soviet borders, occasional overflights by high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, and human intelligence from defectors and agents. The picture that emerged was sobering. By 1950, over 270 Tu-4s were deployed in Soviet long-range aviation regiments. Production continued at multiple factories. The industrial capacity that had reverse-engineered the B-29 in 2 years was now producing strategic bombers faster than American factories built their replacements. The strategic implications transformed Cold War planning. American nuclear strategy had assumed a monopoly on long-range delivery systems. SAC bombers could strike Soviet cities, while Soviet aircraft lacked the range to retaliate against American targets. The Tu-4 shattered this assumption. Soviet bombers based in Eastern Europe could reach Britain, France, and other NATO allies. Forward deployment to Arctic bases put Chicago, Detroit, and other industrial centers within range. Los Angeles and San Francisco were vulnerable to one-way strikes from Soviet bases in the Far East. This mutual vulnerability drove the arms race that defined the Cold War. Neither superpower could afford to fall behind in delivery systems or defensive capabilities. The development of thermonuclear weapons in the early 1950s raised stakes even higher. A single H-bomb delivered by Tu-4 could destroy an entire city. 10 aircraft reaching their targets could cripple a nation. The concept of mutual assured destruction emerged from the recognition that both sides possessed the capability to inflict unacceptable damage on the other. The technical espionage that produced the Tu-4 established patterns that would continue throughout the Cold War. Soviet intelligence systematically targeted Western technology, seeking opportunities to acquire advanced capabilities through theft rather than indigenous development. The Tu-4 demonstrated that this strategy could succeed spectacularly. 3 accidental landings had provided the Soviet Union with technology worth billions of dollars and years of development time. Future Soviet leaders would remember this lesson, directing enormous resources toward technological espionage that acquired everything from jet engine designs to computer technology to stealth aircraft materials. Western security protocols tightened in response. The careless emergency landing instructions that told B-29 crews to divert to Soviet territory if necessary were replaced by strict orders that crews bail out or ditch in international waters rather than risk delivering intact aircraft to potential adversaries. Classification systems became more rigorous. Export controls restricted technology transfer even to allies. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower would warn about emerged partly from the recognition that technological superiority required constant vigilance and massive investment. For the engineers and workers who built the Tu-4, the project represented both triumph and trauma. They had accomplished the seemingly impossible, reverse engineering and mass-producing an aircraft that matched or exceeded American capabilities. Soviet industry had demonstrated it could compete with American technology when properly motivated and resourced. The knowledge and manufacturing capabilities developed during the Tu-4 program enabled rapid advances in subsequent years. Soviet jet engines, radar systems, avionics, and metallurgy all benefited from lessons learned analyzing American designs. But the human cost was significant. The relentless pressure, the atmosphere of fear, the demands for perfection under threat of imprisonment or execution, these conditions produced results but destroyed lives. Workers who made mistakes disappeared into the gulag. Engineers whose components failed were interrogated by the secret police. Even Tupolev himself, despite his success, never felt secure. The project succeeded because failure meant death, motivation that produced remarkable achievements, but at costs democratic societies would not accept. The military impact of the Tu-4 extended beyond Soviet borders. In 1953, Stalin gifted 10 Tu-4s to the People's Republic of China, providing Chairman Mao with a strategic bomber force. Chinese bombers remained in service until 1988, extraordinarily long for an aircraft designed in the 1940s. China even attempted to convert Tu-4s into early warning aircraft, mounting primitive radar systems that proved too bulky for effective operation, but demonstrated Chinese determination to extract every possible use from the aging bombers. The technological legacy of the B-29 and Tu-4 resonates today. Modern. Strategic bombers, whether American B-52s and B-2s or Russian Tu-160s, trace their operational concepts to ideas first implemented in the B-29. Pressurized crew compartments, remote weapons systems, long-range cruise capability, strategic nuclear delivery, all concepts pioneered by the Superfortress and adopted by its Soviet copy. The arms race that the Tu-4 symbolized and accelerated continues in different forms, with nations competing to develop hypersonic missiles, stealth aircraft, and cyber weapons that will dominate future conflicts. The story of Soviet pilots and engineers stunned by B-29 capabilities encapsulates broader truths about the Cold War. American technological superiority was real but not insurmountable. Soviet determination and industrial capacity could close gaps when properly mobilized. Strategic advantage could be lost through accidents, carelessness, or underestimating adversary capabilities. The competition for technological supremacy would define superpower relations for decades, is driving innovations that transformed both military capabilities and civilian life. In August 1985, 40 years after the first B-29 landed in Soviet territory, former Soviet and American aviation engineers met at an air show in Paris. The Cold War was entering its final years, though participants did not yet know it. Soviet engineer Leonid Kerber, who had worked on the Tu-4 project, met with American engineers who had designed the original B-29. The conversation, recorded by aerospace journalists, revealed the mixture of admiration and regret that characterized both sides' perspectives. American engineer James Thompson, who had worked at Boeing's Wichita plant during B-29 production, expressed grudging respect for the Soviet achievement. "We knew they kept our aircraft. We assumed they would study them and try to copy elements. We never imagined they would replicate the entire aircraft, including systems we thought were too complex for Soviet industry to duplicate. When we saw photographs of the Tu-4 at Tushino, our first reaction was disbelief. Then we studied the images and realized they had done the impossible. They copied everything, including mistakes and quirks in our design that we knew were compromises but didn't have time to fix before production. That's when we understood how thoroughly they had analyzed our work." Kerber's response captured the Soviet perspective. "We had no choice but to succeed. Failure meant Stalin's displeasure, which meant death or the Gulag. The American designers could afford to compromise, to accept imperfect solutions that were good enough. We had to achieve perfection or be accused of sabotage. The pressure drove us to extraordinary efforts, but it also meant we could not innovate or improve the design. We copied problems along with solutions because we lacked the freedom to question American engineering decisions. In some ways, the Tu-4 was technically inferior to what we could have designed independently. But politically, deviation from the American model was unacceptable. Stalin wanted an exact copy, so we delivered an exact copy. The reunion revealed a deeper truth that both sides recognized. The B-29 and Tu-4 represented not just technological achievement, but industrial and organizational capability. The United States had developed the Superfortress through a massive program that cost more than the Manhattan Project, mobilizing thousands of companies and hundreds of thousands of workers to produce an aircraft that redefined strategic bombing. The Soviet Union had duplicated that achievement in a fraction of the time, with a fraction of the resources through a combination of theft, reverse engineering, and ruthless prioritization that accepted human costs democracy would not tolerate. Both aircraft symbolized their nation's approaches to technological competition. America relied on innovation, massive investment, and systematic development that produced technological leaps but required years of preparation and enormous resources. The Soviet Union emphasized adaptation, reverse engineering, and rapid deployment that produced results faster, but often at the cost of originality and refinement. Neither approach was clearly superior. Each reflected cultural values, political systems, and strategic priorities that shaped how nations competed. The three B-29s that landed in Soviet territory in 1944 transformed global military balance more profoundly than their crews could have imagined. American airmen completing emergency landings after bombing raids on Japanese targets delivered to Joseph Stalin the technology that would enable Soviet nuclear deterrence and drive the arms race that defined the Cold War. Soviet engineers and pilots, stunned by capabilities that seemed to belong to a future era of aviation, systematically analyzed and duplicated those capabilities, transforming Soviet air power and threatening Western cities with destruction. The story illustrates how accidents shape history. 3 emergency landings caused by mechanical failures and battle damage gave the Soviet Union access to technology America had spent years and billions of dollars developing. The decision to keep rather than return those aircraft violated diplomatic conventions and demonstrated Stalin's willingness to prioritize strategic advantage over Allied cooperation. The reverse engineering program that followed represented one of history's most ambitious technology transfer efforts, mobilizing Soviet industry to duplicate capabilities it could not have developed independently in any reasonable time frame. For the Soviet pilots who flew the Tu-4, the experience revealed how far behind their nation had fallen in aviation technology and how quickly that gap could be closed when political will and industrial resources aligned. They had been stunned by B-29 capabilities that made Soviet bombers obsolete. Within 3 years, they commanded aircraft that matched those capabilities, proving that determination and industrial mobilization could overcome technological disadvantages. The transformation from derision to capability mirrored patterns throughout Cold War competition. Western observers initially dismissed Soviet abilities to replicate advanced technology. The assumption that Soviet industry lacked precision manufacturing, that Soviet engineers could not comprehend complex systems, that Soviet organization could not mobilize resources effectively, these beliefs were shattered by projects like the Tu-4. Soviet capabilities were different from Western capabilities, often crude by American standards, frequently less refined, sometimes more robust, but ultimately effective. The B-29 and Tu-4 thus became symbols of broader Cold War dynamics. American technological innovation met Soviet adaptive capacity. Western assumptions about superiority confronted Eastern determination to achieve parity. The competition drove both sides to extraordinary achievements while consuming resources that might have been applied to human welfare. The legacy continues today as nations compete in domains the B-29 designers never imagined. Cyber warfare, space systems, artificial intelligence, technologies that will shape 21st century conflicts as profoundly as strategic bombers define the 20th century. Standing in the Monino Air Force Museum outside Moscow today, visitors can see one of the few surviving Tu-4s, preserved as a monument to Soviet aviation achievement. The aircraft sits outdoors, its aluminum skin weathered by decades of exposure, its 4 engines silent, its gun turrets frozen in place. Information placards describe the technical specifications and service history, noting the aircraft's role in establishing Soviet strategic bombing capability and delivering the first Soviet atomic bomb. What the placards do not capture is the human drama behind the aircraft. The stunned Soviet pilots who first encountered B-29 capabilities and realized how far their nation had fallen behind. The terrified engineers who worked under threat of death to reverse engineer technology they barely understood. The factory workers who labored with minimal rest to meet impossible deadlines. The American airmen whose emergency landing delivered to Stalin technology that would threaten Western cities for decades. The Western observers at Tushino, who watched in shock as Soviet copies of America's most advanced bomber demonstrated that technological superiority could be stolen and duplicated. These human stories of innovation and adaptation, of fear and determination, of accidental consequences and deliberate choices, define the history of the B-29 and Tu-4 more profoundly than specifications and production numbers. They reveal how technology shapes and is shaped by political systems, how accidents alter strategic balance, how determination can overcome disadvantage, and how competition drives achievement at costs both sides continue to pay. The Soviet pilots were indeed stunned by America's B-29 Superfortress capabilities. Their stunned recognition of American technological superiority motivated the reverse engineering effort that produced the Tu-4 and transformed the Cold War strategic balance. The story of that transformation remains one of aviation history's most remarkable chapters, demonstrating that in the technological competition between superpowers, no advantage is permanent and no capability is impossible to replicate when nations commit sufficient resources and accept the necessary costs. If you found this deep dive into Cold War aviation fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from military history. Drop a comment below telling us which Cold War technology race you'd like us to cover next. And don't forget to check out our other videos on the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.